It's time to begin our regular halacha shir. Before I begin, let me ask you if you have any questions of a halachic nature. We should begin with. Any questions?
I do. So if Shomea Ka'one applies, what in many circumstances for the repetition of the Chazan and during the Chazrat Hashatz, I guess also in Shachrit, but or Mincha, if somebody hears the Chazrat Hashatz, would that be a lesser form of doing the Tashlumim?
Someone who, for some reason, is unable to daven himself or unable to daven herself, maybe because the person doesn't know enough Hebrew or doesn't have a text, or maybe at the moment it's halachically blocked from davening. Someone who for some reason cannot daven himself or herself can 100% fulfill the obligation of davening by listening to the Shliach Tzibur and saying Amen at the end of every bracha. That's the whole purpose. That's the whole purpose. The only purpose of Chazarat Hashatz is the Shliach Tzibur, the Chazan, is motzi anyone who needs to be Yotze Yedei Chavah, fulfill the obligation of anyone who needs that. Go for it. Okay.
Thank you.
The machlokas amongst the poskim regarding this issue is as follows. According to Rashi, Shomea Ka'ona means hearing is as good as saying, but you're not actually speaking. And therefore, even when you find yourself in a situation where you're not allowed to speak, like you're in the middle of Shmoneh Esrei, you can still stop, listen to Kedusha or Kaddish or whatever, listen and fulfill your obligation by listening, and then return to your silent prayer. Tosafot disagree. According to Tosafot, hearing is the same as saying, and therefore, if you're not allowed to say it because you happen to be in a place where you're not allowed to talk, then you shouldn't listen either. Shulchan Aruch paskins that if you are in the middle of your silent prayer and the Chazan comes to Kedusha, you should stop your silent prayer, listen, and fulfill your obligation by listening. Unfortunately, many Chazanim, many Shlichei Tzibur, mumble the words of Kedusha because everyone's going to be singing it out loud. And if you're unable to hear, the Chazan saying Kadosh, 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 if you're unable to hear the Chazan, then it's impossible to follow the psak of the Shulchan Aruch. You have no choice but to follow the approach of Rashi, continue your silent prayer and just ignore it. Okay?
Wait, continuing by Rashi, wouldn't you stop and listen? I thought you were saying, in Tosafot you would ignore it.
Right. Oh, I just said it backwards. Maybe you're correct. You said it correctly.
Oh, okay. Nice.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other issues of a halachic nature? Yes.
I have a little question.
Yes.
So I have a whipped cream dispenser, and my son he's a yeshiva, whatever, and he claimed that you cannot spray it on Shabbos because it comes into this flowery design.
Tell me again what this gadget is.
So it's a dispense, like, like when you buy the whipped cream in the store.
Ah,
But mine's healthier, whatever. And so if you're extruding the
yeah,
oil
and the
already,
extruder has bumps all around the margin, and it comes out with a
right,
nice shape. Mhm,
right. So I bought one without a nice shape, but I was wondering if that is indeed a problem.
mhm. Any question of the pattern? Is such and such a problem? The answer is always yes. As any yeshiva bacha will be happy to explain to you, it's a problem. The issue is as follows. Tikkun ochlim. It's of course prohibited to make a kli, to make a utensil on Shabbos or Yom Tov. That's called tikkun kli. That's of course prohibited. And but what about food? What about doing something which is going to prepare food? This is a machlokas poskim, and many poskim indeed hold that if you're doing something to finish the food the way you want it to be, then that's prohibited. Although many poskim point out, in fact, the majority of poskim point out, this prohibition cannot possibly be correct, because if so, what are you supposed to do? You never, you're not allowed to add sugar to the coffee. You're not allowed to add salt to the potatoes. I mean, anything you do is preparing the food for eating. And therefore, most folks can reject this problem. As far as this is concerned, there's room for a chumrah, but no, not really required. Second issue is mimareach. Mimareach, the prohibition of mimareach is adding a smooth layer to something else. And again, the poskim disagree about whether this applies to foods. Here, most poskim hold the prohibition does apply to foods, and therefore, for example, if you are smearing avocado on bread on Shabbos, you should not make an effort to have an even, smooth coating. Making an even, smooth coating is prohibited. But this prohibition only applies if you're smoothing one substance on top of another. And with what you're talking about is something like a whipped cream dispenser. And here you're not smoothing one substance, the whipped cream, upon whatever it's being put onto, comes out. However, it comes out, you're not smoothing it in place. Minadin, mutar, those who wish to be machmir should refrain from doing it.
Mhm.
Where do you get the kind without the design?
Oh, so I bought a circle one that has no design. I ordered it.
Okay, a different pia. They call that the pia, where the mouth where it comes out. It's called the pia. Okay, any other issues of a halachic nature? And before I begin, I want to check. I think I'm recording. It says recording dot dot dot. That should be good. No, I get the stuff on the screen. No, didn't do it. I'll put it on the screen. Share. No, it's a share. Here we are. Oh, we did it. Okay. We want to talk about ladles. A ladle is what you use. Just like the soup, out of the soup pot, and then put into the bowl, which you're going to serve at the table. It could be any other liquid, but soup is the most typical thing that you use a ladle for. I want to understand the halachic status of the ladle, and this is going to reveal some important halachic ideas which have broad application. it says in the Gemara in Shabbos, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avnei, Pa'am achat, once, Nichnasti acha Rebbe lebeit mechatz. Once, I followed my teacher into the bathhouse. Bikashti lahaniach lo pach shel shemen ba'ambati. And he had this jar of oil that he was going to use to anoint himself, to make his rough skin softer. That's what people used to do in those days. I guess many people still do it today. They have skin cream and all kinds of stuff like that. Back then, they were using olive oil for the purpose. And I told my Rebbe, let me dunk the jar into the hot water of the mikveh, and it'll warm up. It'll be more pleasant when you rub it on your skin, and it will work better when you rub it on your skin. Amarli, my Rebbe said to me, Dol, don't put the jar of oil into the hot water of the mikveh. Instead, take a bucket of hot water out of the mikveh. That'll be a cliche. Now, the bucket was not actually being heated like the water in the mikveh. This is a cliche. But take a bucket of hot water from the mikveh, v'ten, and place the jar of oil in that to warm it up. Well, that's the story. And the Gemara continues, Shema min atlat. We learn three things from this story. The Gemara wouldn't have told the story unless there was at least one important thing to learn from it. In this case, there are three important things to learn from this story. Number one, Shema mina shemen yesh bo mishum bishul. First of all, we learn that oil, in this case olive oil, has a prohibition of bishul, of cooking. Now, unlike most things, when you cook them, they change. Cooked potatoes are not like raw potatoes. Cooking changes the food noticeably. A raw potato becomes a cooked potato. Well, oil, when you heat it up, it's the same oil, it's just warmer, that's all. I mean, nothing happened to the oil except it got warmer. You might think that's not called bishul, that's not called cooking as far as Shabbos is concerned. And we learned from this story that just heating it up is called bishul. Same with water. When you heat up water, that's called bishul on Shabbos, even though the water is unchanged aside from the temperature. That's the first thing we learn. In order to be guilty of cooking on Shabbos, it's not necessary that the stuff change. In addition to being heated up, it's enough that they're heated up. I'll give you another example. The blacksmith who heats up a piece of iron in the forge to make the iron softer so that he can work with the iron, just heating up the iron in the forge, that's bishul if it will be done on Shabbos. Okay, that's the first conclusion from the story. Shema mino. Second thing we learn from the story, cliche ni'enu bashul. Second thing we learn is that the prohibition of bishul on Shabbos pertains only to kli rishon, only to the utensil, which is actually being heated. Once the food, the liquid, is put into a second container, in this story, the bucket, which is not actually being heated, it's just the residual heat. Because water was in the mikveh, that's not called bishul and is permitted on Shabbos. Shema mina, the third thing we learned from the story, hefshero zeh bishulo, just warming up is called cooking. Okay, now, of these things, the one which I want to focus on is the second, the middle conclusion, the distinction between Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni. Once again, Kli Rishon is the pot, the utensil, which had the source of heat. A flame was under it. An electric heating element was in it. Some source of heat. Heat is being added to the Kli Rishon. That's Kli Rishon. Kli Sheni, no heat is being added. No flame under the Kli Sheni. No electric heating element. No heat is being added to. The only reason it's hot is because the food or the liquid was taken from Kli Rishon. Now, let's understand the conceptual difference between them. I'll give you an example of the problem. You hold the problem in the back of your mind, and then we'll see what the poskim have to say, and then we'll understand the rule. What about a thermos bottle, a vacuum flask by any other name? You take hot water from a Kli Rishon and pour it into a thermos bottle, a vacuum flask. Well, it's true that there's no heat being added in the thermos bottle. On the other hand, the only reason it exists is to maintain the heat. Is that still called Kli Sheni or not? Let's see what the Tosafot say. Here we have the text of the Tosafot. And Tosafot teaches us a number of ideas which I personally find spectacular. Tosafot quotes the Gemara. Shmamina Kli Sheni ein marasha. The prohibition of cooking is impossible when using a Kli Sheni. That's what the Gemara learned from the story. Tosfos says, Tema, that's bizarre. How could the Gemara say such a thing? You notice in passing that the commentators, the Mefarshim, the Tosafot, are not willing to simply accept what the Gemara says. They want to challenge what the Gemara says. It's bizarre. Bizarre, this idea that Kli Sheni cannot cook. My Shna, what's the difference? My Shna, Kli Sheni, Kli Rishon. What's the difference between Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni? I understand one was on the heat, one wasn't on the heat. But what's that have to do with cooking? Yad Soledes, if it's very hot, if the Kli Sheni is very hot, I feel a Kli Sheni nami. Kli Sheni can also cook. Just imagine. I take a few liters of very hot oil from a Kli Rishon, and I pour the boiling oil into a Kli Sheni. It's very, very hot. True, there's no flame under it, but it's still, we'll put in some potatoes, and you're going to have fried potatoes in a few minutes. You see with your own eyes that it's going to cook. To take a few liters of boiling water into a Kli Sheni, crack an egg into it, you have a poached egg. You see that the egg cooks. Try it yourself. It's how else would you make a poached egg? The Ein Yad Soledes. If we're talking about contents of a Kli, which are not hot, it's not hot. I feel Kli Rishon nami ein mavashal. Well, Kli Rishon also cannot cook anything if it's not hot. The distinction between Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni is bizarre. The only thing that makes sense to the Tosfos is either it's hot enough to cook, or it isn't hot enough to cook. If it is hot enough to cook, it's going to cook. Whether it's a Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, whatever it is going to cook, that should be a Torah violation. If it's not hot enough to cook, so be a Kli Rishon on the fire as well. Nothing's going to happen. Well, Tosfos says Yesh Lomar. That little word, Yesh. Little word Yesh is such an important word. Oh, so important and so vague, so imprecise, so many possible ways of understanding it. Yesh, followed by an infinitive verb, yesh lomar, can be translated accurately and precisely into English in two opposite ways. It might mean one ought say, one should say, one must say, one is forced to say as follows. Alternatively, it might be accurately, precisely translated as saying, one could say, one might say. The following is a possible explanation. And there's no simple way to know which of these two meanings, which are more or less opposites of each other, which meaning is intended by the Tosfos. This is rather similar. Where's my chat? Here's my chat. Rather similar to what always disturbs me are the Rashi Tevot Kuf Lamed, which so many rabbis like to add at the end of their exposition. Rabbis have whatever it is they want to say at the end. They add the Rashi Tevot. That's supposed to be a Kuf Lamed. So there you go. It's Kuf Lamed. What's it like Kuf Lamed? Anyway,
You got it right.
On my screen, it looks like Kuf Nun. In any event, Kuf Lamed can correctly mean kasher lahavin, and it can correctly mean kal lahavin. Two opposite meanings. In any event, let's see the approach of the Tosafot. Lefi shekli rishon metoch she'omed al ha'or.
I'm sorry, Rav Fink, what did you say the other meaning was? Kasher lavin?
Kasher lahavin or kal lahavin. It's hard to understand or easy to understand. Which did he mean?
Thank you.
Yeah, and especially someone like me who can't figure out what he's talking about in the first place. And, I hope he means it's hard to understand because I didn't grasp it. Someone more clever than me who might have figured out the whole thing halfway through reading it might have said, "Oh, Kal Havin, of course." It's very easy. I figured it out halfway through.
Maybe that's the whole chachma of the Rosh Tevot is that it's like a build your own story path. You figure out what it meant.
You're absolutely correct, and that's the poetry behind the expression Yesh Lamar. It's 2 minutes. And in any event, or with a dot on top means light. Ur with a dot in the middle means fire. Kli Rishon, since Kli Rishon is standing on the fire, Dofnotav Chamim, the floor and the walls of the pot are hot. Umachzik Chomo, and it maintains its heat, Zman Meruba, for a long time. Let me rephrase this in conceptual terms. Thermodynamically, as far as thermodynamics is the science of the movement of heat. Scientists love to study how heat moves from one place to another. That's called thermodynamics. In Kli Rishon, the direction that the heat is moving is from the fire or electric heating element, whatever the source of the heat is. The heat is moving from the source of heat into the floor and the walls of the pot, and from there into the food or the contents of the pot. That's the direction the heat is moving. Therefore, in a Kli Rishon situation, where the heat is moving from the floor and walls of the utensil into the contents, the temperature of Yad Soledet Bo determines whether or not you're guilty of cooking. Aval klisheni, which is not standing on the ur, on the source of heat, afagav the Yad Soledet Bo, even though it might be very hot, mutar. There's no prohibition of cooking. She'ein dofnotav charim, because the walls and the floor of Kli Sheni are not hot. Holech u'mitkarer, and the direction of heat flow is from the contents of the pot into the wall and floor of the pot. Just the opposite of Kli Rishon. Kli Rishon, the contents of the pot are either warming because heat is moving into it from the walls and floor of the pot, or the flow of heat is at least enough to maintain a constant heat in Kli Rishon. Kli Sheni, on the other hand, the temperature of the contents is declining because the contents are losing heat to the walls and floor of Kli Sheni. That's the conceptual difference. For those who remember what they were taught in the differential calculus in high school or wherever you were taught it, for those who remember, I just rephrase the whole thing in Newtonian terminology, right? Newton or Leibniz, you can argue about who originated the theory. Either Newton or Leibniz taught us the following terminology to explain what's going on. The first derivative of temperature with respect to time is non-negative in a Kli Rishon. That's the Newtonian way of saying that the temperature of the contents of the pot is either being maintained, zero change, or rising, either positive change, rising, or staying the same, non-negative. And in Kli Sheni, the temperature in the course of time is declining as far as the contents of the pot are concerned. That's the idea. Now, if you think about it for a moment, in Tosafos that we have on the screen today, we don't know exactly the date because we don't know exactly which generation of Tosafot wrote this, but it's surely from the High Middle Ages, maybe as late as the 13th century. How much earlier than that is hard to say. Newton and Leibniz were contemporaries. And we're talking here about 5 centuries before Newton and Leibniz, but the Tosafot clearly had an understanding. It clearly had in mind the fundamental concept of gradients changing, slopes, things changing slowly in the course of time, whether it's constant, increasing, or decreasing. These ideas are already embedded in the Tosafot. Okay, we understand the ideas. Let's just summarize, and then we'll get to the important stuff. Kli Rishon stands on the fire, and therefore the heat is moving from the flame into the pot, into the contents of the pot. Kli Sheni, the the heat is moving from the contents of the pot into the walls and floor of the pot, so the temperature is declining. Thermos bottles, therefore, although they maintain their temperature fairly well, depending on the quality of the vacuum flask or the thermos bottle, still the temperature of the contents is decreasing, cliche in every sense, and all the great poskim agree with that. Now comes the question of matzeket, a ladle. The ladle gets stuck into a kli rishon, and you take the soup, or whatever it is, you take the soup from the kli rishon in the ladle, pour the soup into this bowl that you're going to serve, the people are going to eat from at the table. I'm assuming that you're not using a soup tureen. Some people will first fill a soup tureen and bring that to the table and serve from that. I'm skipping the tureen step for simplicity. Since the ladle goes into the kli rishon, does it have the status of the kli rishon? If so, the bowl that people eat from is kli sheni. If, on the other hand, the matzeket ladle is a kli sheni, then the bowl is a kli shlishi. And let's see why this is an important distinction. Kevan sheyesh osrin bishul acharafiyah. This is a machlokas poskim, but bottom line, the Shulchan Aruch paskins and all the modern poskim agree. Yesh bishul acharafiyah. That means that something which is fully baked, like a piece of bread, fully baked, perfect to eat, still carries with it a violation of bishul, of cooking, if you cook it again on Shabbos. It underwent dry heat in the oven. That's called baking. If you now cook it in a liquid, that's very different than baking. That's cooking. You're now guilty of cooking. You have two violations with bread. If you bake it on Shabbos, you're guilty of baking. You plunk it then into the hot soup, you have a second violation of cooking bread on Shabbos. Well, Pasaka Shulchan Aruch, shelo litain pat, afilu b'kli sheini sheyad soledes bo. And therefore the Shulchan Aruch paskins that bread, pat, fully baked bread, is prohibited to put into a hot kli sheni, because now you're cooking it. Oh, but the Gemara just taught us earlier that kli sheni eino mevasher. There's no such prohibition as cooking in kli sheni. So how is it possible that there's a prohibition on Shabbos to cook bread in a soup bowl because it's a hot kli sheni? The answer to this is because some exceptional foods are very easily and quickly cooked. The example of the Gemara is the Michigan fish and potatoes. What is the Michigan recipe for fish? I'm talking about the Upper Peninsula. The recipe is as follows. You take a big pot of boiling water. You put into it your potatoes, and you boil the potatoes. As soon as the potatoes are done, you remove the pot of boiling potatoes from the flame, and you pour in your fish. The residual heat cooks the fish, and then the fish are served with the potatoes. That's the recipe for making fish in the northern peninsula. The whole idea is that fish require very little cooking. After all, the proteins, the proteins in fish are designed. Fish are cold-blooded, and therefore the enzymes and the proteins, everything in the fish are designed to be stable at colder temperatures. And therefore, just a little bit of heating is enough to cook them. Unlike people who eat meat, those are warm-blooded creatures, and the enzymes, the proteins, everything in them are designed to be stable at higher temperatures, and therefore you need much more cooking in order to cook a piece of meat than you do for a piece of fish. The bottom line, the Gemara says there are some things like fish which cook so quickly and so easily that even in Kli Sheni, you're not allowed to cook them. And for better or worse, the Gemara does not give us, for better or worse, is a polite way of saying, unfortunately, the Gemara does not tell us exactly how to define what is and what is not easily cooked in Kli Sheni, and therefore the Shulchan Aruch says, shouldn't cook anything in Kli Sheni. Do it in Kli Shlishi, just to be sure. And therefore, baked bread, fully baked bread, maybe just putting it into hot soup and Kli Sheni will cook it. Don't do it. First put the soup in a Kli Shlishi, and then put in the fully baked bread if you wish. The Ramah writes, Nahagu lizaher lechatchila shelo liten pat afilu b'Kli Sheni kol zman sheyahu le'atzlo. Machaber, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and the Sephardic poskim, the Ramah and the Ashkenaz poskim all agree on this. Kli Shlishi is necessary. Now let's think about it for a moment. If the ladle is a Kli Rishon, then the bowl that you're eating from is a Kli Sheni, and it's simply prohibited to put in a piece of bread. On the other hand, if the ladle is a Kli Sheni, then the bowl you're eating from is a Kli Shlishi, and there's no objection to putting the bread into it. Oh, that's a big difference. Well, Mishnah Berurah says that if you want to put a piece of bread into the soup, yamtin ad shelo yeh yad selezbo. Wait until the soup is so cold that it can't cook anything. You'll notice Mishnah Berurah, Kedarko bekodesh, has not the slightest interest in improving your culinary sense. All he's interested in is whether or not it's a violation of Shabbos. Just wait until the soup cook is no longer hot, and then put the bread in it and eat it. Or at least take your soup spoon, take some soup out of the bowl. Now the soup spoon is Kli Shlishi. Put the piece of bread into the soup spoon, and then you can eat it. You need either Kli Shlishi, ladle was Kli Rishon, the bowl you eat from is Kli Sheni, the soup spoon is Kli Shlishi. You need either Kli Shlishi or wait until it's not hot anymore. Kol shekei nimerotzeli ten b'tzali shumim l'toch hamarak. All the more, all the more, if you want to add some onions or garlic to the soup, same rules apply. Lachen, zakaf sheshoev v'knera yesh l'din Kli Sheni. The Mishnah Berurah is teaching us that the ladle has a status of Kli Sheni. Why? I think the understanding is fairly clear. He doesn't say why, but it's obvious to me. You put the ladle into the Kli Rishon, the direction of heat is from the walls of the pot into the soup, into the ladle, into the contents of the ladle. The direction of heat is exactly correct for the ladle to be defined as a Kli Rishon. Well, this is one understanding. However, the Mishnah Berurah contradicts himself. This, incidentally, is not rare. I used to be very bothered by contradictions. in the Mishnah Berurah. Doesn't take much to bother me. I can get bothered by anything. But this is one of a ton of things that used to bother me a lot. But in my dotage, I've calmed down and become a little bit more mellow. And it doesn't bother me so much that there are contradictions in the Mishnah Berurah. The reason I have calmed down on this issue is because the son of the Mishnah Berurah, published a biographical sketch of his father, which is published as the introduction to the 3-volume set entitled Kol Kitvei HaChafetz Chaim. And there, the son, in his biographical sketch of the father, says in passing, my father, the Chafetz Chaim, was not the only author of the Mishnah Berurah. There were 3 of us. My father hired me for 1.5 rubles a month, and he hired my brother-in-law, his son-in-law, for 1.5 rubles a month to help write the Mishnah Torah, the Mishnah Berurah. And different passages were written by different authors. There were these 3. I was one of the 3 authors. And then the son of the Mishnah Berurah proceeds to list a number of contradictions in the Mishnah Berurah. And he says, the reason we have these contradictions is because this was written by my father, this was written by my brother-in-law, this I wrote, differences of opinion. Well, once I read that there's no reason why there has to be consistency, no reason why we should insist that everything in the Mishnah Berurah be consistent. After all, there are 3 authors with divergent opinions on different matters, so I'm no longer so excited about contradictions. But here's a contradiction coming up. Im shoev b'kli rekan b'toch kli rishon. If you take an empty utensil, like an empty ladle, and draw soup out of the kli rishon, some people hold that the ladle has a status of kli rishon. ובפרט, אם משך כלי בתוכו עד שמעל לרתיחה, that's especially if the ladle rests a long time in the soup. But you see, in this passage, he's not so convinced that it is so. In this passage, it's only a yesh omrin. It's another approach, according to which the ladle is klisheni, and therefore the bowl you eat from is already klishlishi. Well, now I become very interested in this because I want some bottom line, practical conclusion. Bottom line, if someone asks me, shall I say, consider the ladle to be kli rishon because that way you surely won't get into trouble on Shabbos? Or is it okay to consider the ladle kli sheni? Let's see what the great poskim say. Minchas Yitzchok of Dayan Weiss, the head of the Eidach HaReis, the current head of the Eidach HaReis is also Dayan Weiss, but not a relative of the previous Dayan Weiss. This is the previous one, the one who survived the Holocaust. He explains the contradiction by carefully reading the Taz, who in turn quotes the Maharil. Kli sheshoev mayim rotchim mekli rishon mikriach kach kli sheni. The Maharil held that the ladle is kli sheni. Rak im hu mashed kli shoev toch kli. Only if you leave the ladle in the soup pot for a long time does the ladle become a kli rishon. But the Taz disagrees with the Maharil. The Taz says אם שואב בכו בכלי ריקן מן הכלי ראשון, אותו כלי ששואב יש לו דין כלי ראשון לחומרה, ולא לכולה. According to the Taz, the ladle is always a kli rishon. According to the Maharal, it's a kli rishon only if it stays a long time in the soup. Machlokas poskim. Nimtza, it turns out to have a sveka dedina. Should we hold like the Maharil, that an ordinary ladle is kli sheni, or should we hold like the Taz, that an ordinary ladle is kli rishon? Lachein, therefore, and here comes the important part. Besafik sheben kli rishon l'sheni. If the question is putting a piece of bread into the ladle, which is a suffix, maybe it's rishon, maybe it's sheni, there we have to be strict because of the possibility that you might be violating Shabbos min ha-Torah. You have to be mahmir, as the Mishnah Brura is. That's if the question is on the status of putting bread into the ladle. What is the status of the ladle? That's not really a practical question. The practical question is, what about putting soup into the soup bowl that you're eating from? Besafik sheben kli sheni lekli shlishi. Oh, the soup bowl has a different suffix. It's either sheni, according to the Maharil, according to the Taz, sheni according to the Taz, or it's already shlishi according to the Maharil. That's the bowl you're eating from. Ube'inyan bishul achar afia hina yesh matir ma'afila b'li rishon. Once you get into a suffix, sheni, shlishi, the chashash of an Isur Torah is set aside, and now we're talking only about an Isur D'Rabbanan. Oh, so if the question is, can you put a piece of bread into the ladle? Suffix, and we have to be strict because maybe it's a Torah violation. If we're talking about putting a piece of bread into the soup bowl from which you eat, that at worst would be a violation d'Rabbanan, suffix d'Rabbanan l'kula. Therefore, we should be lenient and paskin that it's okay. The underlying rule here is that suffix d'Oraisa l'chumra, being strict in cases where the poskim are in disagreement regarding a Torah prohibition requires being strict. Paskining in a case where there's a disagreement among the poskim, but the worst is a rabbinic violation. There, it's the lenient opinion that we should grasp. That's the approach of the Minchas Yitzchak. The Oz Nidbaru, by Rabbi Yomin Zilber, he was the leading disciple of the Chazon Ish. He observes the same problem in understanding the Mishnah Brura, and he agrees entirely with the approach of the Mishnah Brura. This then is the approach, mainstream approach of the poskim. Bottom line, the status of the ladle is in doubt. Could be Kli Rishon, could be Kli Rishon, could be Kli Sheni, and therefore the status of the bowl that you eat the soup from is equally in doubt. Could be Kli Sheni or could be Shli Shlishi, depending upon the possibilities of the ladle. How to paskin? A suffix between Kli Sheni and Kli Rishon, we must be strict. Suffix between Kli Sheni and Kli Shlishi, we should be lenient. That's the approach of the poskim. In short, suffix d'Oraisa l'chumra and suffix d'Rabbanan. A suffix d'Oraisa l'chumra and suffix d'Rabbanan l'kula. That's the point of the ladle. I'm going to pause with this and ask you if you have any questions that you wish to ask at this time.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
If you take the Kli Rishon, you remove it off of the heat source. A pot is on the blech, for instance. You've removed it. Have you turned that into a? Does that have a different status?
No. The moment you remove the pot from the blech, from the plata, from wherever it was being heated, the walls and floor of the pot are still hotter than the contents. The flow of heat is still into the food. It's still a kli rishon, and it maintains that status as long as it's still yad solidus.
In the text, it said uve'inyan, and then I don't remember exactly, but it said something about is it towards the end, at the end of the Minchat Yitzchak, it said matirin, and I didn't understand why it said binyan bishwal harafia matirin afilu kli rishon, and I didn't understand what it said.
Because if it's prohibited, it's only a rabbinic prohibition. Yes.
Even though it said afilu kli rishon.
Right. Still would only be a rabbinic prohibition.
Oh, meaning if you picked up the ladle and you put bread in it, and it was actually a kli rishon, it would be rabbinic?
Correct.
Oh, wow.
Because the bread is already baked.
Oh, okay. The idea of suffix, right, the chumrah and suffix, the rabbanan kula, hakel, it seems from someone's perspective who doesn't understand the depth and breadth of halacha, I only know so much. If I'm nervous to apply that, because then I'll, on my own, because then I might miss a lot of detail.
Of course, it can only be applied when you're sure that it applies. But that's not the key question. The key question is, why is it suffix d'Rabbanan l'hakel? Why is it suffix d'Oraisa l'chumra? As far as suffix d'Oraisa l'chumra, the reason is fairly simple and straightforward, pretty obvious. You don't want to run the risk of violating a Torah law, heaven forbid. But why, oh why, do we say suffix d'Rabbanan l'kula? Why are we not so concerned about violating a rabbinic law?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a key question. The simple answer is, we'll get to the complicated answer in a moment. The simple answer is built in to every rabbinic law. When the Sanhedrin legislated whatever they legislated, built into all rabbinic legislation is that it should apply only in cases where it's clear and certain. Built into the rabbinic regulations is a rule that it should not apply in cases of doubt. The name of this concept is Hem Amru, Vehem Amru. They who created the prohibition simultaneously created the leniency. Hem Amru, Vehem Amru. They created the prohibition and they said it should only apply in cases of certainty. That's the simple answer.
Certainty answer, of what specific?
That the prohibition certainly applies, definitively applies. More complicated answer is that of the Rambam. Rambam has a more complicated way of viewing things. Rambam holds that Torah prohibitions themselves apply only when it's clear and definitive that they should apply. According to the Rambam, if there's any suffix, any doubt about the application of a Torah prohibition, then it is Chazal, it is the Rabbanim who said we should be Mahmir. And therefore, it's turned into a rabbinic prohibition. In cases of doubt, a Torah prohibition changes into a rabbinic prohibition. That's the Rambam's approach. Now, if you have a suffix regarding a rabbinic prohibition, there is no rabbinic law telling us to be strict, and therefore the Rambam holds that, of course, we're lenient in suffix d'Rabbanan. It's more complicated. Rambam is a more complicated way of looking at things. Tough.
Wow. Do you have an example of that? Sorry.
A piece of suffix Basa v'chala of treif, whatever the Isur might be, Isur Torah. If it's a son, whether or not this food falls under the category of the Torah prohibition, so according to the Rambam, it's rabbinically prohibited to eat it. If that in turn, if something which is originally a rabbinic prohibition is in doubt, then the rabbis only said to be strict regarding Safek Deraisa. They never said be strict regarding Safek Derabanan in their foods. The psak is lakula.
Thank you.
That's a more complicated way of looking at things. Any other issues for today? And I'm going to pause and wish you a good week.
Can I add
Sure.
Sorry, can I ask an unrelated question?
That sounds like Jody, yes.
It is. Sorry, can't put my camera on. It wouldn't help because it's all dark. But when lighting candles, is it on the Erev Shabbos? What is it the lighting of the candle that brings in Shabbos or the bracha?
In general, it's the bracha which does it. In general, it's the bracha. But as I'm sure you know, if you're under pressure and have in mind that you're not accepting Shabbos when you say the bracha, then Shabbos does not begin yet, and you can have that.
What
in
about
mind
extinguishing the match?
Oh,
Do you have to have it in mind in order to extinguish the match? No.
Well, once you not extinguish the match, once you just drop it in a place where it will go out by itself.
So do you need to do that anyway?
In general, yes. If you have in mind that you're not accepting Shabbos, then no, you can
Until the
extinguish
bracha.
the match. Yeah.
Okay, and you can do that just as a normal.
Once you not do it regular, Mishnah Berurah is not happy with doing it regularly, but occasionally, if necessary, he's okay with it.
No, I mean just in terms of like, as you light, have in mind that you can extinguish the match and then say the bracha. No.
You can, but the Mishnah Berurah is not happy with it. And he
Even
says
that,
it should not be a regular thing.
Thank you.
Okay.
But which author of the Mishnah Berurah said that?
Probably the Chavetz Chaim.
Touche.
Chavetz Chaim wrote the bulk of it, so probably him. It's an interesting question. Maybe we could stylistically separate the different authors. Maybe I'll even try it. You know, there were two statisticians back in the 1980s. There were two statisticians, Wallace and Mosteller, who did a statistical analysis of the Federalist Papers in the history of the United States. The founders of the United States in the colonial period wrote a series of essays called the Federalist Papers, and they were published anonymously. After the American Revolution, the anonymous authors of the Federalist Papers fessed up and gave lists. You know, I wrote numbers 1, 3, 6, and 8. I wrote numbers, and they disagreed about themselves about who wrote what, which ones. And since then, historians have been arguing about who wrote Federalist Paper number 16. It was claimed by two different authors. Along come Mosteller and Wallace, these two statisticians in the 1980s, I believe, who said, well, we can do a statistical analysis of syntactic phenomenon in the known writings of one author, and the statistical distribution of these phenomena in the known writings of the other author, and then look at the text which is disputed and see statistically whether the syntactic phenomena are closer to this author or that author. And they came up with very convincing arguments about exactly who wrote which of the papers. Perhaps we can apply the same methods in this case. I'm going to look into that.
Now you can use AI to do it, right?
Unless it hallucinates, correct. It's hard for me to keep up with contemporary terminology, but I think what we used to call lying, we now call hallucinating. Is that, do I have it right?
Probably.
Sounds right.
Yeah. Okay. So I wish you a good week and a safe week. Good Shabbos.
Amen. Thank you. You too.
Look forward to seeing you again next week.
Amen. Thank
Shabbat
you. Thank you.
Refuah
Stay strong.
Shema, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Amen. Amen. You too. Bye.